or your mic. We're just glad that you're joining us. We'll go ahead and start at this time. It's 1:32 in the afternoon here, Central Standard Time in Minnesota. Bonjour, Billy. I see you here on the screen. You're somewhere in my area. I want to welcome you to An American Indian in the Classroom. Our hope is that this afternoon, the session will help you explore how historical educational oppression is linked to contemporary oppression in the classroom as well as in schools. It'll also be an opportunity to offer some guidance on how to overcome these barriers to support our Native youth as well as their families. I'm going to switch over to our presentation. So hopefully everybody can see this on the screen. And our presenter today and myself will be guiding the screen. Brian, another thumbs up if you can see the presentation. Wonderful, thank you. So let's see if there's anybody else I need to admit to today's session. We have a lot of people trying to join right now, so bear with me for just a few moments. Every time I click it, there's another group.
Another one waiting there, yeah.
In the chat, you should see a link that I'll speak to later on. It's available for you to click on after our presentation. The Mental Health Technology Transfer Center is who is sponsoring this event for today. Specifically, the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, which is national, although there are regional centers across the country serving different parts of the United States. We are the only one that is serving our Native communities under the K-12 Mental Health Supplemental Project. In addition to us, we have the Traumatic Stress Initiative, Category 2, sponsoring today's event. We are located at the University of Iowa, and we're a part of the national network serving American Indian and Alaska Native children across the United States and Alaska. We provide technical assistance for our tribal communities and schools, as well as having several ongoing initiatives and projects for our American Indian and Alaska Native youth and their families. We are sponsored by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The content of this event is the creation of the presenters, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian and Alaska Native MHTTC. A few housekeeping guidelines for everybody. We know that sometimes we have different points of view, so we want to make sure that everybody's respectful of one another's point of view. Please be mindful that sometimes we may not be able to hear you, so that might be a little symbol or a signal that you might get from me if you are trying to speak. But we are going to have questions and answers at the end of today's session, so be mindful of that. You'll be given that opportunity if you so choose. In addition to that, post those questions in the chat so that I can read them if you don't want to share them out loud. The session is being recorded. We invite you to keep your microphone muted until the end of the session and if you have a question to ask. Following today's event, you'll receive a follow-up email, which will include several things: a link to the presentation that you'll be seeing, the slides, the recording, etc. The slides that will be recorded, the presentation that will be recorded, will also be available on our YouTube channel for the Native Center for Behavioral Health. So if you don't get the email right away, go to our YouTube channel and you should be able to find it there. Lastly, you'll be given a link to our evaluation survey, the GIPRA, which I've already put in the chat room. It's important for our center as well as our funders. So we invite you to please take the time to do the survey. It's beneficial to our program, especially those of you who attend today and who want to have us offer more opportunities like this in the future. Your participation is voluntary, but we really want to invite you to take the time, and it's just a few minutes, to help us by completing the survey. You can skip any questions that you wish or that you don't want to answer, and know that all your responses will be kept confidential and they cannot be linked to you. If you have questions about the survey, you're welcome to reach out to myself or anybody on our staff. Here before you see our land acknowledgement, and it's an opportunity for us to recognize, although we're gathered here virtually, we want to take time to acknowledge the land and pay respect to our Native nations whose homelands were forcibly taken and inhabited. So please take a few moments to read through this land acknowledgement. It was created by 3 of our staff members, Ella Driscoll, Keely Driscoll, and Sean Bear. We have a team that serves our Native children in the K-12 program. Here on the screen, you see our co-director, Teresa Brewington, who works for the Native Center for Behavioral Health. She also oversees the Native Child Traumatic Stress Initiative, Category 2, as co-director. She's an enrolled member of the Kahari tribe and a descendant of the Lumbee tribe. She holds 2 master's degrees and is currently working on her PhD. She's held various positions across the country in education, as a director, as a principal, serving Native and minority students. She currently resides in Iowa on the Meskwaki settlement. I'm Dr. Allison Bays, and I serve as the program manager for the center. Specifically working in the K-12 program, I have looked at using my skills, my expertise that I've acquired over the last 25 plus years in the K-12 and higher ed setting, serving Native children and their families. Most of my research focuses on Native populations so that I can look at best practices from a Native cultural lens. I'm originally from South Texas with the Tapilam Coitecan Nation and currently reside in Minnesota. We also have 4 ladies serving our office who are all graduate students pursuing degrees in the mental health field. At this time, I'd like to invite somebody in our audience to share with us a prayer, a song, words of wisdom.
I could sing a song.
Wonderful.
Okay, just 1 second. I don't have my drum with me, so I'm not working from home today. I'm in my office. But I just my name is Kevin Hale. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. My clan is Kishichini, born for Tochogoji. Just want to ask, sing this song, and there's a phrase in it called "Wajona Shah," walking beauty, and I'll ask the Creator just to accept my humble song for today, for blessings for all of us here in this webinar today. Okay. Ho-yo, hey, hey-yo, hey, ho-yo, hey, hey-yo, hey, hey-yo, hey, ho-yo, hey, hey-yo, hey, hey-yo, 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 hey, hey-yo, ho-yo. Hey, 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 yo, hey, 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 yo, hey, hey, Wajana Shah, hey, yo, hey, yo, hey, yo, hey, hey, yo, hey, hey, Wajana Shah, hey, yo, hey. Hey yo, hey, hey yo, hey, ho, hey yo, hey, hey yo, hey, hey yo, hey yo, hey yo, hey, hey yo, ho, hey yo, hey yo, hey yo, hey. Hey, Wajana Shah, hey yo, hey yo, hey yo, hey, hey yo, hey, Wajana Shah, hey yo, hey, hey. Oh, thank you. Bonjour, Thank you. Blessings for all.
Dr. Kevin, thank you for your prayers, for your song, and for your words. Today we have Dr. John Gonzalez as our featured speaker, who's an Ojibwe from the White Earth Anishinaabe Nation and professor of psychology at Bemidji State University, where he also received his undergraduate degree in psychology. He earned his doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of North Dakota. Dr. Gonzalez's professional interests are in cultural psychology, multicultural psychology, and community psychology. All of these areas come together to provide a holistic view of people and their environments. His research interests are in the areas of mental and behavioral health for Indigenous people and ethnic minorities. Dr. Gonzalez has investigated the racial experiences of American Indian students, as well as Native people's racial experiences accessing healthcare. He also has expertise in multicultural and Indian education, serving on the Indian Education Parent and as a school board member for Independent School District number 31 with Bemidji area schools. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Gonzalez.
All right, well, bonjour, everybody. Chimi Gwitch to Kevin for sharing that song with us. I really appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share my screen and kind of get us started here. Can you all see the presentation now on my screen as well? Or where we left off there with, okay, perfect, thanks. All right, well, you heard that, you know, okay, is my clicker gonna work? There we go. You all heard the, or saw the formal introduction of me, but I wanna, you know, give you a little bit more of a personalized one as well so that people know who's talking. How makade, maingana cause gawa babi gonna kagan donjiba, ajijik indodame. So I, you know, want to introduce myself in my native language there first. One of my names is Black Wolf, and I do come from the White Earth tribal nation just down the road from me right here in Bemidji, and I am a member of the Crane clan. So, you know, my dad always taught me that, you know, when someone is speaking, or if you're going to get up and say something and, you know, claim to know something, that people should know who's talking, and especially the spirits who are present should know who's talking as well too, in terms of, you know, why you got to say what you got to say. So like I said, I wanted to give you a little bit more of a personal introduction of me in terms of who I am and my story and where I come from. So yes, that's me right there in the middle, that young native child there. That's the 1970s Indian look there for For some of you who might not recognize that, but I'm sure that there's a few folks who are with us today because sort of like, hey, I dressed just like that when I was a kid back in the 70s. But yeah, that was me. That is me. That's what I looked like when I went to school. I think that was about 8 or 9 years old right there. You know, that's the big old native headband style and the crazy shirt that I probably argued with my mom to wear that day and everything. I'm sure that I did. And so on. That's my mom in the upper right-hand corner there in the middle. And some folks might recognize the two guys next to her there. That's Vernon and Clyde Belcourt, you know, both co-founders of the American Indian Movement. And then, and if you heard, you probably heard that, you know, Clyde just passed away recently as well too. You know, down in Minneapolis there. So my mom is actually the last surviving member of her family, of her brothers and sisters in the Belcourt family. So I share that because, you know, AIM was a big part of my life growing up, and it shaped a lot in terms of how I see the world and the experiences that I've had. And, you know, the sense that, you know, as a Native person, you got to speak up sometimes and you got to raise your voice and you got to fight for Native people. And that really, you know, stuck with me throughout my childhood and then into adulthood. And it's a big part of sort of who I am and what I do. The person on the left of me there is my dad, Jim Ironlegs Weaver. And again, some folks in Indian country might know that person as well, or may have heard of him. He was, you know, also an activist and you know, someone who stood up for Native folks, Native rights throughout his life. He was a victim and a survivor of the boarding schools, and I'll come back to a little bit of his story a little bit later as well too. But of course, having someone like that in my house as well too, and you know, hearing those stories of what it was like in the boarding schools and the things that he lived through and survived growing up as a Native person certainly shaped the way that I, you know, see the world, and you know, gave me the strength and gives me the strength still today to keep doing and the stuff that I do, and particularly around American Indian issues and for Native students as well. Below there, below my dad, that's a picture of me and my wife, who is Japanese. She was an international student here at Bemidji State University, where I got my undergraduate degrees too. We graduated together. We met as undergraduate students. That's a picture of us in Japan several years ago. No, I think that was 2015. We actually had a sumo tournament there, and then on the other side down there, those are two of our kids, Kyler and Sage. They're a little bit younger then, but that's us at a powwow. That's our stoic Indian look right there. So we're mad because that guy's got too much fry bread on his plate from the feast. Hey. So, and then that's us several years ago as ninjas. You know, one year we stole that pumpkin from the neighbor's garden. No, I'm just joking, but it's all good. So I share that, of course, as well as, you know, that you know, having been married to a Japanese woman. Can you all hear me now? Okay. Did I get cut off somewhere along the line there? But I'm good now. Okay. So I share that because that, you know, being married to a Japanese woman for the last 20 years has also expanded my awareness and my sense of, you know, what it means to be a multicultural person living in a multicultural world. So, you know, and then all of those things, you know, continue to shape my world, and I continue to sort of grow and you know, as we sort of go through this journey of life. So I wanted to share that with folks as well too, our attendance. And I really appreciate everybody being here with us today. So let me, you know, jump into just a quick little outline. You know, I mean, you know, we only have so much time together, and you know, there's a lot to say and a lot to discuss and talk about, but I'm hoping to sort of get through some of these topics today and give some examples of each one of these. We're going to go through some quick, brief definitions because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we all sort of understand the things that I'm talking about in terms of the terms that I'm going to use. And so far, I'm going to give a few brief microaggression examples. I'm sure that folks have heard that term now. It's been, you know, been around for quite a while, but in the last few years, it's been sort of used more and more. But I'm going to walk through a few of those and a couple of specific ones for American Indians as well, and particularly the American Indian student context, because unfortunately those things happen more often than they should. Provide a little bit of a historical context for folks in terms of, both in general of how oppression works in society, but then specifically for American Indians in educational settings, link that to the contemporary context, walk through a few examples of some American Indian student microaggression experiences as well, and then talk a little bit about, sort of how do we, work through a little bit of that trauma that Native folks experience in our educational systems, right? What our Native students are experiencing. And then, maybe even if we have some time, go through a quick sort of student example of what that might look like in the real world. Okay, so that's my plan today. That's what I'm hoping to be able to get through here. And again, my clicker's not working. There we go. So again, what are we talking about? Real quick, some brief, definitions here for folks. And I, you would think that people would be more aware of these or sort of have, sort of more of an understanding of these, but unfortunately, I still sort of see confusion about some of these terms. So I'm going to quickly walk through these. Again, not spend a lot of time on this, but just so that we're all on the same page. So race, culture, and ethnicity in particular, people tend to use those terms interchangeably. They're not the same thing. Just want to make sure that we understand that race really is, people still believe that race is biological, genetic in some way, but it's not. It's a socio-political construction. It was something that was created to basically justify oppression, justify genocide, justify, all of those different forms of oppression that Native people have experienced and other people of color have experienced as well too, right? Culture is not the same as race, although those things of course are related to each other, but they're not the same. Really, culture is again, people's sets of values, beliefs, behaviors, practices, things like that. Their ethnicity actually has two definitions in some way. There's a legal definition, which I'm not going to get into, but the more this layperson's definition, which is this, it's a combination of our racial, cultural groups that we often think about, right? Whether or not someone is, American Indian or African American or, Asian American or those kinds of things there. That's how we typically think about ethnicity, right? But again, they're not the same, quite exactly the same as culture and race. They're different from each other. And then prejudice, discrimination, and oppression. And then again, microaggressions. I'll go into a little bit more details of those there in a second, right? Again, those are not the same thing, right? Prejudice is basically having negative attitudes about something, prejudging something or somebody, right? That can lead to discrimination, but it doesn't always have to lead to discrimination. Everybody carries around prejudice that we've acquired in our lives. We don't act upon those prejudices and then end up discriminating against somebody, right? So again, understanding that is really important. But of course, discrimination is the negative treatment or denying somebody access to something. I think we all basically understand that for the most part. And then oppression, right, is this unjust use of power and authority to create advantage for certain groups in society. And there's many different forms of oppression, right? You have racism, sexism, classism, basically all of the isms that exist in society are different forms of oppression, but oppression is this larger overarching system that impacts everybody, right? In various different ways, but it's the idea that some group has the power in society and they use that power to create the norms, they create the laws, they create the policies that disproportionately impact certain groups of people in negative ways. And then microaggressions, again, this fancy $10 research word that somebody came up with a while ago, is really talking about these subtle forms of discrimination that are directed towards marginalized group members. And there's, racial microaggressions, there's, gendered microaggressions, there's microaggressions towards people that experience disabilities, women, people of the LGBTQ community, and so on and so forth, right? We all experience microaggressions if you belong to a certain marginalized group, and often many of us do. And sometimes we belong to many marginalized groups, unfortunately, right? So again, want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of that. So I'm going to jump into a few examples of some microaggressions and then get into, talking about this historical context in relation to American Indian people and how that trauma from the past impacts us today, right? So let me give you a couple of examples of how insidious microaggressions are, because that's really where the nitty-gritty happens in the day-to-day life and interactions that we have with each other in society, and certainly in our educational settings, right? So here's one that I think really shows how pervasive they are in society and the ideas that we've acquired over generations of oppression. So both during the 2008 and the 2012 presidential campaigns, many political commentators, used phrases such as this, that Barack Obama has transcended race, or that he has transcended his Blackness in order to be elected president, not only once, but twice, right? And again, on the surface, it sounds like a wonderful thing, right? That we've elected a Black man as president, again, not only once, but twice we did it, right? I mean, it's crazy what happened since then, but that's a whole nother story. But sticking to the topic at hand here, right? On the surface, it sounds like that's a wonderful thing. And in fact, it sounds like a comment, right? But really, if you think about this, what does this really mean? Right? There's an underlying message here. There's an underlying meaning that shows us how pervasive the ideas of race are in our society and how oppression continues to work in these hidden ways. And of course, the underlying, and many of you probably are seeing sort of what the issue here is. And again, we could spend a whole hour just talking about that. But really the underlying message here, right, is that there's something wrong with being Black in America. And that the only way that Obama could be elected president is that he had to rise above that, because that's what transcend means, right? Transcend means to rise above something. And the only way we could elect a Black person as president is that somehow they had to rise above his Blackness, that they had to rise above being Black, right? You see sort of how the hidden sort of messages is and how that actually works in society. I mean, that's sort of the very insidious way and very pervasive way that race functions and different forms of oppression function in our society. Is that on the surface, we sort of sound like we're saying something positive and then we're saying a good thing, but yet there's always an underlying message there. There's an underlying meaning that goes behind that. And we do this in common interactions on a day-to-day basis, right? Again, I know, that this, sort of seems like this very sort of small thing or whatever, but these small things add up. Here's a couple of more. And the one on top in particular should, a lot of Native folks should be able to pick this out right away, but I'll give a few folks a few minutes to sort of think about this. So the one on the top there, Geronimo, EKIA. And if I could see everybody, I'm sure I could see people sort of nodding, oh yeah. But, I don't know how many people remember this or even know what this is referring to. But let me sort of just quickly sort of go through this. So Geronimo, EKI, was the message that came over the wire when they killed Osama bin Laden. So Obama and his team were in the ready room, right? And then, they executed this military operation over in Pakistan, and then they killed Osama bin Laden in that home in Islamabad, I think is, or I can't even remember say the word right now, but in the city that he was or whatever, right? So they said, so Geronimo, E stands for enemy, KIA is killed in action. Again, for some folks who are military folks probably recognize this right away, right? Now, again, people are probably saying, what is this all about? What does that mean? What's that got to do with the microaggression and so on, right? So here's the deal. Native people right away across Indian country were offended by this, and rightfully so. And the reason why is because Geronimo was the code name that they gave to Osama bin Laden, right? Now stop and think about this for a moment, right? I'm not, Apache, right? But I know who Geronimo was. And growing up as a kid, Geronimo was one of my heroes, right? And we probably have some relatives in the audience here that recognize this right away, right? That, he was a hero to Native people across Turtle Island, right? Even if you're not Apache, you know who Geronimo was, and you sort of idolized that, him growing up and so on, right? So for the US government to give the code name of Geronimo to the world's most notorious terrorist was really a slap in the face for American Indian people. And there's several reasons for that, right? And one of them is because we've always and forever have been the enemy of the US government. I mean, going back, way back, right? Because it's always been about the land, right? We've always been seen as the enemy for the US government. And this was just another one of those examples that they could sort of do this and say something like this and give the code name of Geronimo to Osama bin Laden. And then the other reason why this is really a slap in the face for American Indian people and a huge microaggression is that people don't know this, but American Indian people serve in the military at the highest rates of any other racial group in the US. That more American Indian people step up and serve in the military more than any other racial group in the United States, percentage-wise, relative to our communities, right? So again, another example of how these things sort of just function in society and sort of operate sort of behind the scenes. You have a couple of other examples there and some political commentary and things when people make the comments, you know, like when someone isn't, you know, doing what they're supposed to be doing or whatever, you know, that they're off the reservation, quote unquote, right? That they're acting out of line. Again, that's a microaggression for American Indian people. And again, most Native people on here will probably recognize that right away, right? Is because at one point in time that was illegal for us to leave the reservation. In fact, you could be killed on the spot if you left the reservation. So for us to continue to have that in our discourse, in our verbiage, and for people to sort of just, you know, use those comments and use those terms randomly really continues to show how insidious and how pervasive and how hidden the types of biases that exist towards Native people and other people of color continue to exist in our society, right? Now, I could go through many, many examples of this and sort of, you know, walk you through, that would be a whole nother presentation if we wanted to sort of get into the nitty gritty in terms of how all of that works. But I'm going to quickly move on and give you a couple of real quick examples of some student context stories of where microaggressions have occurred. Some of them pretty blatant, and some of them, you know, still quite hidden, you know, in our classrooms and so on. So, you know, most folks recognize, again, most Native folks, I'm assuming here, and certainly, you know, non-Native folks will recognize the picture of the young woman there with the not the person themselves, but with the red handprint over their face. And what that symbolizes, right, is it symbolizes the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women across Turtle Island, right? Well, there's a story that actually happened right here in Bemidji, in fact, a couple of years ago now, where there was two middle school girls who were in their art class one day, and you know, it was a couple of days before February 14th, which typically, you know, that's Valentine's Day, of course, but that's when you'll see marches and protests around the country to memorialize and bring awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives, right? So it was a couple of days before Valentine's, and they were in their classroom, and they asked the teacher, you know, there was an art class, right? So they asked the teacher if they could, you know, put the handprint on their face using paint. The teacher you know, understood what was going on and said, yes, of course, no problem. So they did this, right? But then later on that day, around lunchtime, there was one of the administrators in the building, and some other teachers didn't know what was going on. And they, you know, assumed that this was some kind of like gang, you know, insignia or some gang sign or something. And they were, you know, they got into an argument and were, you know, they were forced to basically wash that off their faces, right? So this caused a big ruckus in the school, of course. There was some other stuff that happened as well too, with one or two of these girls and some other friends of theirs, where they ended up getting into a fight, you know, an argument with the administrators about all of this. But this sort of, again, shows, right, how Native students in our schools who are trying to do something good, trying to do something right, continue and experience trauma as a result of just being Native and just trying to express that nativeness in the classroom, right? The other, you know, picture of the young boy there with braids, I think, you know, we've all sort of seen and heard. There's a couple of famous examples where students or teachers have forced young boys to cut their braids off, actually in the school, right? Again, another sort of example of a traumatizing experience that our Native youth continue to experience in our classrooms. This, in fact, I don't have quite that traumatizing example but something happened to my youngest kid, Sage, who wears his hair long, right? And is at the middle school as well too, here in Bemidji, right? And one day in gym class, they had a substitute teacher that day, right? And then, the substitute comes in and, for whatever reason, I'm not even sure why, but, tells, the kids to, to break up into, girls on one side, boys on the other side, right? So of course, my son Sage goes with his friends who are boys, on the other side of it, but he has a long braid, he wears his, his hair long and has a braid in the back, right? And then the substitute teacher comes over and says, hey, I said girls over there. And he's like, yes. I'm a boy, right? And then, but it took 2 or 3 times for the teacher to finally acknowledge, and then even Sage's friends had to argue, with the substitute teacher that Sage is a boy, he should be here, he's a boy. Even though he has, so again, it sort of just shows, right, how there's a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding of how Native youth and families function and live our lives, right? I got many stories, but I kind of want to move on here because we have a lot to sort of get to here, whatever, right? Let me quickly sort of talk a little bit about some of the, why are microaggressions a big deal and how are they related to education and so on, right? So, there's several reasons why I'm bringing up and talking first about microaggressions. And the issue here, right, is again, because these are common interactions that happen every day between individuals and that our students continue to experience in the classroom. And of course, what goes along with that is that there's a whole bunch of psychological dynamics around microaggressions that cause the people who experience microaggressions to expend additional energy that's not needed. And the reason why is because of these dynamics. The first one, of course, is the clash of experiential realities, right? Again, experience shapes our realities, and what we experience on a day-to-day basis across individuals, but certainly across groups of individuals, is very, very different. So our perspective, our reality is shaped by those experiences that we have on a day-to-day basis. And if you don't share those same experiences, your reality is going to be different, okay? And again, we could spend a lot of time sort of, just getting into the nitty gritty of that, but I'm hoping people sort of recognize that, right? So me as a man don't have the same experiences that women do, right? I don't experience sexism, for example, as a man, right? I can see sexism and I could recognize when it happens, but I don't have that same experience on a day-to-day basis. Right? I probably hear about it once in a while. I might see it in the news once in a while. My wife will tell me about her experience once in a while, right? But I don't experience on a day-to-day basis. It's not the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning, right? If you're a person of color, when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you think about is, okay, am I going to experience a microaggression because of my race today? If you're not a Native person, or if you're not a person of color, if you're a white person, you never have to think about race. Right? That's the idea that experience shapes our realities. And then we have a clash of that sort of happening, right? The second dynamic, of course, which is important to understand in context of what we're talking about, is this invisibility of unintentional bias and discrimination, where the idea that people who commit microaggressions, they're very sincere in their belief as non-biased individuals, right? I mean, this is where it really gets tricky. I mean, this one is the really sort of the crux, one of the crux of the issue here, right? Is that because we live in a paradoxical society, right? On the one hand, we're all taught these values of fairness, of equity, of justice. You don't discriminate against people. You treat people how you want to be treated, and so on. I mean, those are sort of almost in some ways our foundational values as a country, as a society, right? Of equality. But on the other hand, we live in a very unequal society where all around us, we have inequity everywhere. If you just look, you see it. How does that go together? right? And the reason how that goes together, right, is that we're all taught, right, to be fair, to don't discriminate, to not be racist, right, not be prejudiced. So we sincerely believe that we are, and most people, in fact, are good people. Okay, don't get me wrong, but even good people can engage and perpetuate discrimination and engage in microaggressions, right? And that is really, really hard for us to grasp sometimes, right? And that's what makes it invisible, right? The third one here is perceived minimal harm of microaggressions, which is a microaggression in and of itself, actually. You know, when someone is called out for engaging in a microaggression or for saying something that's racist or discriminatory or sexist or whatever it is, right? And then you call them out and then you say, oh, hey, dude, just relax, calm down. You're overreacting. Why can't you just let it go? Right? Which is, again, a microaggression in and of itself, because you're actually denying that person's experience, which is a microaggression, right? Their experience as a marginalized group member. And then the last one, which is really, really tricky, is the catch-22 of responding, right? Because when a person experiences a microaggression, all of these questions go through your mind. And you have to start asking yourself, did I think what happened really happened? Did they really say what they said? Did they mean what that? Did they know what they said that? Or, you know, do I say something? Do I not say something? You know, what are the consequences if I do say something? How do I those consequences? If there's consequences for you, if you don't say something, because you got to deal with that, you got to deal with that extra stress that you're experiencing in that situation. All of that psychological energy has to be spent on that. In fact, there's research. I've done a research study in healthcare settings that showed that experiencing microaggressions increases cortisol levels in individuals, which impacts our stress response, which can lead to health issues in the long term, right? So it is a big deal, right? So that's the problem, right, with the catch-22 of responding and so on. And of course, the negative effects of that, you know, are numerous. And, you know, I could spend a lot of time sort of going through this, but certainly we should be able to understand that this creates a hostile and invalidating educational climate for our youth, right? It devalues group identities. It continues, you know, perpetuates stereotype threat. I'm hoping folks know what stereotype threat is, especially if you work in an educational setting. You should understand the idea that if a stereotype exists for a group and you're a member of that group and you find yourself in that situation where that stereotype can play itself out, that you actually act the way that the stereotype assumes, right? It has a negative impact on school performance and academic performance for people of color. That's the idea of stereotype threat. And that's, I don't know, if you want to know more about that, look up Claude Steele and Dorothy Steele and others who've done lots of research sort of in that area, right? But, you know, one of the other things that we really, you know, it harms people mentally in terms of our mental health and our psychology. The emotional turmoil of having to deal with microaggressions on a day-to-day basis takes its toll over time, right? Okay. So again, I want to open with that because that's really what our Native youth often experience in the classroom setting, and I'll give you plenty of examples of those a little bit later as we go through. But I want to kind of move through here and provide a little bit of, okay, so how do we get to this point where microaggressions are happening all the time, right? Well, unfortunately, because we have a long history. We have a long history of oppression in our society, right? And we cannot deny this, although some people are trying to prevent us from even talking about this in our schools, which is just absurd, right? That we can't even teach history anymore. But these things have happened, right? Colonization happened. In fact, white folks would not be here if colonization did not happen, right? Slavery happened. We know that happened. Stolen lands happened. The idea of manifest destiny has happened, and then numerous government policies and practices, right? And I've got a bunch of slides with some images here, and I'm just going to quickly go through these because I don't have time to sort of break it down to every single, you know, and give you examples. I mean, I think most people should understand that these things have happened, right? They're part of our history. They're part of who we are. The idea of manifest destiny, right? The idea that, you know, that this land was sort of, you know, that white folks, Europeans were ordained, you know, to take this land and use this land in terms of how they saw fit. They thought it was, you know, their right, that it was God given to them and so on, right? Government policies and practices, right? Westward expansion, moving across the West and all of that. These are real things that have happened. The idea of relocation, we often hear about just a trail of tears. We forget that this is plural, that trails, again, trails of tears happened. It wasn't just one trail of the Cherokee, right? Even in the South, East, there was numerous trails of tears that happened where Native people were forced from their lands. It happened everywhere across Turtle Island, right here in Minnesota. Everywhere you go, that Native people were moved here, moved there, forced to go here, forced to go there. My reservation, in fact, White Earth, is not traditional Ojibwe land. We were all relocated there from around Lake Superior. My grandmother is a Charette her family comes from the Red Cliff lands over there in Wisconsin, right? But her family was relocated to White Earth. We were all sent there. That's not our traditional Ojibwe land. That's Dakota land where we are, right? So these things happened everywhere. And that has had a huge impact in terms of the way that Native people function in society. It didn't just happen to Native people, right? It happened to women. Women were one of the people that were marginalized and oppressed the most in our society. They continue to be oppressed, right? Other racial groups in our society, the idea that, only white folks could be Americans. This was the law of the land all the way up until the 1950s, in fact, that only white folks could be citizens of the United States. And what these are some famous cases that sort of, the Japanese man, his name is Ozawa Takawa. Takawa Ozawa, his name is, and then the Indian dude there, but got sent in. Very famous cases from the 1920s where they try to challenge, this white by law citizenship clause. It was in the 1790 Act that was passed by Congress, right, to become American citizens. But both of their cases were denied by the Supreme Court. It's a fascinating history. If you don't know that, check it out. And because the court contradicted themselves, actually, that's what makes it fascinating in terms of, their reasoning in terms of denying citizenship for each of these individuals and so on, right? Of course, other government policies and practices, right? But one of the biggest ones, of course, that affects American Indian people, especially in educational settings, is the assimilation policy or the boarding school era that happened. This is one of the most profound, most impactful policies that continues to live with us today, especially in our K-12 educational systems. This image, of course, is one of the most famous ones that's used to talk about the boarding school era. I'm sure many of you have seen this over the years. Does anybody know this person's name, by the way? Real quick, if you do, he has a colonized name, of course, an English name that was given to him, but he also, of course, has his native name, right? Well, his colonized name was Tom Torino. That's the name. He was one of the original students at Haskell over in Pennsylvania, or not Haskell, I'm sorry, at Carlisle over in Pennsylvania, right? His English name was Tom Torino. But he was Navajo, he was Dene, right? And his Dene name, and I don't speak Dene, so I probably will butcher this, but I believe it was Hastin Tohatli is what his indigenous name was, right? And he's used, there's a story behind this, of course. There's stories everywhere, right? But his image is used, it was originally used, right, to show the benefits of education for American Indian people, right? Even his skin color is sort of lightened and everything in the photos, where first, he's got long hair and it's cut and then, put in the suit and everything or whatever, right? But in fact, he actually ended up going back after graduating from Carlisle, went back and lived his life as an indigenous man and continued to ranch out in, which of course this guy didn't like, right? So again, this is Carlisle, or the founder of the Carlisle Institute in the Indian Industrial School. And of course, we all have probably heard this, at least I hope you've heard of this before, right? That this is this famous, saying is that, in order to, to solve the Indian problem, right, we have to, kill the Indian in order to save the man. Richard Pratt, was the one who sort of proposed this policy and then, put it into practice, right? And it was never about education. It was always about assimilation and trying to rid Native people of their Indianness, right, of their culture and so on, right? Again, of course, he claimed to be a friend of the Indian people, and maybe he did care about Indian people in some way or whatever, but it was certainly misguided. And the impacts of that to this day are profound, right? Again, we've all seen this image as well too. Literally there was thousands of kids that went through Carlisle. Some of us, I'm sure that, some of our ancestors actually, some of our relatives that are with us today are probably descendants of folks who went to Carlisle, right, who survived those boarding schools. Again, if you don't know this, a quick for a primer for folks here, right? There was 2 different types of boarding schools that occurred during the boarding school era, right? There was these government ones that were run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right, or the Bureau of Indian Education, which was part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then there was these mission-run schools where they contracted out to churches around the country, right? Here's just a couple of examples of those, or a couple of places of those. My dad, who I mentioned at the beginning, was a survivor of the boarding schools. He was born in 1920 in a little shack next to Rat Lake on the White Earth Indian Reservation, which is about 15 miles east of the village of White Earth. They came and got him when he was about 6.5 years old and sent him to Pipestone, Minnesota, which is, if you know geography at all, or the folks from Minnesota probably know where that's at. South Dakota folks probably know where that's at as well too, which is about 150 miles from Minnesota. And it's a little town just off the border of South Dakota, down in southwest Minnesota, right? So they sent him there. Several of his family members, his brothers and sisters, were sent there as well too. Of course, when he was in there, or not of course, but unfortunately, when he was in there, his parents and his grandparents died when he was in boarding school. So he never got to see his immediate family, at least his parents and his grandparents again. When he went to boarding school, in fact, he spoke mostly Ojibwe, spoke some French as well too, right? If you know your history, there's, the French were up here in northern Minnesota back in the days, and spoke some English as well too. But certainly when he ran away when he was 13, actually, from the boarding school. He says he escaped. That's the language he uses in the stories that he shared with me. He ran away when he was 13 years old, and he was basically on his own since then. And then when he left, of course, he spoke hardly any Ojibwe at all, and didn't speak any French. I mean, they even beat him when he spoke French, which was the crazy thing, right? Is that he couldn't speak French or Ojibwe. He only could speak English when he was in the boarding schools, and he was punished for speaking French or Ojibwe. So when he left, he spoke mostly English and still spoke some Ojibwe, but he wasn't fluent anymore after those 7 years of being in Pipestone, Minnesota. So he ran away when he was 13, and he was basically on his own ever since then. He was drafted into the war in World War II, fought in the Army, actually served over in the Philippines, and then lived most of his life in Minneapolis and Chicago, and then back up on the reservation up here in White Earth as well too. So there's a great irony actually in his story, in the sense that he doesn't have a high school education, actually had this really, really terrible experience with education, right? But yet he was the one in our family who stressed education the most, which is, really sort of, ironic in the sense, that he was the one who always said, that you have to get an education, and you got to use the white man's tools to help our people. You got to use the white man's tools against them. That's what he would say to us all the time growing up. And I wish I would have actually listened to him more when I was younger. You know how that goes, right? When you're a teenage boy, especially, you kind of like, what do you know? Oh man. Well, of course he knew more than I knew, and probably still knows more than I know, right? But I didn't actually graduate from I share that because I didn't graduate from high school. I actually got kicked out of high school, which is another long story, which we don't have time to get into right now. But I was expelled from the school that I went to on the reservation, and got my GED. But I did listen to him finally later after I got into all kinds of trouble and, went to college and, now I got a PhD. So it's, it's all good. He got to see me graduate from undergraduate to get my degree in psychology, but he passed away when I was in graduate school. So he didn't get to see me get my PhD. He actually wanted me to be a lawyer. I'm sorry, it's a little side note here. He wanted me to be a lawyer because he wanted me to fight for Native rights or whatever. But I was like, I think I had enough trouble with or enough interaction with the criminal justice system. I don't think I want to do that anymore. So my mom's story is a little bit different. I want to share that as well too, because it's similar, but it's not quite the same. My mom didn't go to boarding school. She wasn't sent away for boarding school, but she went to the mission school, which was on the reservation. So she got to come home during the day, but she still did not have a good experience with education, because she went to the, St. Philip, I think it was St. Philip's or was it St. Thomas? There was a mission school right in White Earth. That's actually where the Circle of Life Academy is right now. The Native tribal school is in that same location now. But she didn't have a good education experience as well, right? And it really impacted and affected the way that we, interact with education. My dad, again, always wanted us to go to school, but my mom was okay with if I didn't want to go to school, she was like, okay, fine, you don't have to go to school. I mean, I remember one year, 8th grade, I missed I think I missed 80 days of school or something because I experienced a lot of racism and discrimination in school. So I didn't want to go to school, right? So, and she was fine with that, right? And that's one of those direct links between the past and now, because, we know that, that a lot of our Native youth and families experience high rates of absenteeism in our schools. And part of the reason, of course, is because of our unique relationship with education and those experiences that our moms, our aunties, our uncles, our grandmas and our grandpas and our great grandmas and great grandpas had with education. That education was not seen as a good thing for us. Education was seen as something that changes you, that makes you a white man or a white person. That's what education was seen as and continues to be seen as, unfortunately, in our schools, right? Because of all of these traumatizing conditions that we've experienced, that our ancestors, that our relatives experienced when they were in these boarding schools, right? So it was okay for us not to go to school because our parents and our grandparents knew these things happened to us while we were in school. We knew that our kids were going to be traumatized in some way and so on, right? It still happens today. In fact, my mom was raising a couple of her grandkids and great grandchildren. And there was times I would call her up and, just to check in, she lives about an hour away from me, right? So I would call my mom and see how she's doing and stuff, right? And, I be talking and visiting, and then I hear, one of my nephews in the background, and I'm like, it's Thursday afternoon at 1:00. How come Jesse's not in school? And she was like, oh, I didn't want to send him today. He didn't want to go to school today, and it's okay. And I'm like, Mom, Jesse got to go to school. What are you doing? So again, this is how you can make that direct link to some of these issues that we continue to experience, is where it's, again, education is not sort of seen in the same way that the Western society and the Western school system see education and the importance of that, right? We cannot underestimate that. And I know I'm sort of, beating a dead horse or whatever, but it's really, really significant. And it's really, really powerful in terms of how that continues to affect us today, right? How the past is linked to the present. And of course, this is from Minnesota, and I'm sure that it's slightly different, but I would say it's not much different in your home state, wherever you might be right now, right? This is another one of those legacies of oppression in terms of the education disparities that exist in our schools for Native folks. Here in Minnesota, we have the lowest graduation rate for American Indians. In fact, it just hovers around 50%. Again, which is something that we should all be mad about. I mean, every educator should be upset about this, right? It's the other thing interesting is in Minnesota, we live in a paradox here, because on the one hand, we're touted as like, we're always like in the top 10 in terms of, the best educational outcomes, right? Our student learning outcomes and graduation rates in the country. But on the other hand, we actually have some of the highest education disparities across the board. We rank like 49th for Black students. We rank like 50th for Latino students. This is just I think this is like 2019, 2020 data here, right? And of course, we rank, dead last for American Indian student graduation rates in Minnesota. Again, that's something that, I mean, it's embarrassing, right? That we as a society, as a whole, continue to allow our Native students to experience these types of education disparities, to not graduate from high school. And this is not something, I mean, this is 2019 data right here, but it's been this way. It's been this way forever. The bottom blue line there is American Indian students going all the way back to 2012 here in Minnesota. And I'm sure if you look at this data in your own state, you would probably see a similar pattern, right? I came across a paper the other day where there's a colleague down at the University of Minnesota who wrote a paper that, our Native students are not dropping out. They're being pushed out of schools. It's not that their kids are dropping out of schools. In fact, they're being pushed out of schools. And the reason why they're being pushed out of schools is because of things like this. Here's another big part of it. So the past, of course, is a huge part of it. But then in contemporary times, in terms of how it continues, oppression continues to happen in our schools, is because of the things that are happening in the classrooms right now. The first one has to do with these cultural models of education and what we think about that and what that actually means and how different cultural groups think about education and what education is supposed to mean. And then, of course, the other big part of it has to do with the curriculum issues themselves. What's actually being taught and how it's being taught in our classrooms and how that disproportionately affects American Indian students and other students of color, right? So the first, real quick, in terms of these cultural models of education, and next week I'm actually going to go into this a little bit more in a little bit more detail. If you're able to come back for next week's presentation on Thursday, that'd be great. But real quick, this idea of cultural models of education has to do with, again, what does a cultural group believe it means to be a teacher? Who's a teacher? Who shares knowledge? Who is able to share knowledge? Who's able to hold knowledge? Right? And how does that get shared with members of society? That's one of the levels of this idea of a cultural model of education, right? Different, again, in Western society, in a Western cultural model of education, which is what our public schools are, or just our schools in general are, right? Is that the teacher has the knowledge, right? And the teacher is supposed to share that knowledge with other folks. They're supposed to be the experts. But in many American Indian societies and cultures, it's that mom, dad, auntie, uncle, grandma, grandpa, those are all teachers. They all have knowledge that they're able to share. And then even the youth sometimes have knowledge and experiences that they can share as well too, that there's this reciprocal sort of relationship that happens, right, between teacher and learner, right? That sort of idea and that, sense does not exist necessarily in our K-12 schools, right? And then, of course, what does it mean to be a student, right? What is a classroom supposed to look like? And how you're supposed to act in that classroom? All of those things are embedded within these cultural models of education. And again, in many Native communities, our sort of idea of what it means to sort of acquire knowledge and to learn things doesn't always match. And in fact, it doesn't match a lot of times with what the Western education system looks like, right? And then, of course, when we get into curriculum issues, again, I could go through many, many different examples of this, but these are just some of the big ones here, right? How we teach Columbus, how we talk about Columbus, certainly how we talk about Thanksgiving, right? I mean, we've made some huge strides in the last few years related to this in terms of, many states and cities and things like that. They're, proclaiming, that first Monday in October to be Indigenous Peoples Day, rather than Columbus Day, but it's still a federal holiday. So of course it's still talked about in schools, and it starts very, very young. I mean, I remember my kids bringing home in kindergarten, bringing home little cartoon characters of Christopher Columbus, right, on the Santa Maria and the Pina, and this happy, jolly dude, right, who discovered, America and so on. I mean, it starts in kindergarten, sort of, this doctrination of that. And then, how we talk about Thanksgiving and things, I mean, just US history in general, right? And then how Christianity is embedded within our school system, even though there's supposed to be the separation between church and state and so on, right? And then representation is another big issue within our curriculum systems, where Native kids do not see themselves in the curriculum. They rarely, if ever, see themselves at the front of the classroom, right? Unless, I mean, a lot of students who are in tribal schools are lucky to have more Native teachers, but I'm telling you, in many public schools, it's not the case, right? In fact, my kids who went, all the way through the public school system, we have a 9th grader and a 12th grader right now. I also have a son who's older as well, in his 20s, who did his 9th through 12th grade here in Bemidji. They've only had one, they've actually never had a Native teacher for their primary teacher. The only time they've had a Native teacher is if they took like Ojibwe language and culture, or that one time they had Dan Needham. Maybe some folks know Dan Needham. He was a longtime gym teacher here at the middle school, where they had, Dan for physical education. But other than that, they've never, and this is Bemidji, Minnesota, where 20% of our students are American Indian. We're sit in the middle of 3 of the largest reservations in Minnesota. And there's only 1 or 2 Native teachers that are the primary teachers in across our schools here, right? We have about 5,000 students in general across the whole district and so on, right? So I know I'm kind of going kind of quickly or whatever, but there's I could say more and more about that, right? But that's a big deal. And it again, how we teach history, right? These guys, they're sort of seen as heroes in American society, but of course, all 3 of these presidents have, Indian blood on their hands, right? And again, I don't need to go into all the details about that, but, if you don't know, you need to know, right? You need to sort of look that up again, again, all these different policies and so on. But there's one other, thing that's actually really profound. That, again, it's not sort of necessarily talked about within the curriculum or within the sort of school system itself, but it really, really has a big deal in terms of how Native students interact within our public school or within our school systems in general, right? And it has to do with this cultural orientation of individualism versus collectivism. We're Native folks, we are very collectivistic, right? We care about the family, right? And the family usually always comes first. It's the most important relationships that we have is our family, and that's very collectivistic. And as a result of that, we become very interdependent on each other. And a big part of our identities, in fact, are wrapped up in our family's identity in terms of who we are, right? For most non-Native folks and white folks in general, in our public school systems in general as well too, don't sort of teach that value. It's more of an individualistic, independent self. You are responsible for your behavior. You are responsible for your grades. You need to be the best. You need to do your best. That's a very, very different cultural value and mindset, right? And the way that looks sort of visually is this. Again, yes, of course, we have, if you're an independent person, come from a collectivistic culture, yes, of course, you have relationships. You have a mom, you have a dad, right? You have siblings, co-workers, friends, and so on. And, and of course, you care about them and so on and so forth, right? But there's a distinction between you and them, right? But if you come from a collectivistic background, right, those relationships between you and your family members and your friends and your coworkers are much more permeable, right? They become part of you and you're part of them. And again, that's really, really important, right? Because that shapes our motivations, right? That shapes sort of how we see the importance of this curriculum or this assignment that I'm supposed to be doing, or am I really supposed to be competing with my classmate? He's my really, really good friend, or she's, I really, really, get along with this person. I mean, this idea of competition and sort of being in competition and doing the best and trying to be the best and get the best grades that you can in the classroom, those things don't always jive well with our cultural values and our cultural orientations, right? So again, kind of coming back to this idea of curriculum issues and how that plays itself out in the classroom and so on, right? It's really, talking about microaggressions and misrepresentations, just the fact that we rarely ever see ourselves in the curriculum. And when we do see ourselves, it's often in a negative light. It's often in a negative sort of situation, right? Let me give you a couple of quick examples for my own children's. I'm a professor, so I keep calling my kids students, but they're not. I keep calling my students my kids, but whatever, vice versa, right? So I remember a couple of quick examples here. One time, my 12th grader who was in 5th grade, we sit around at dinner and we, talk about how things are going and, what's going on in school and things like that. I remember one time we were sitting around having dinner and just checking in. How are things going in school? What are you guys, learning about this and that? And then I remember my son telling me, that, we're learning about the Jamestown colony. I'm like, okay, that's part of our history, nothing wrong with that necessarily, well, tell me about it. What are you learning about that? What's going on? And he goes, oh yeah, man, those colonists, they were having such a hard time, they had to, they didn't have no food. They're dealing with famine and, hurricanes and hostile Indians. And I'm like, whoa, I'm like, hold on a second here. What? You saw the picture of him. I mean, he's this dark little native kid, right? I'm like, whoa. I'm like, hold on a minute here. Where did you hear that? What do you mean hostile Indians? And he goes, oh yeah, that's what it said in the video that we were watching today. And I'm like, oh no, okay, here we go. I'm like, first of all, you have to do a little bit of re-education here. They were not hostile Indians, right? They were, just people trying to protect their land, trying to protect their way of life, from people who were, sort of invading, their land and their territory, who were, trying to kill them and so on, right? So we had to have this long discussion and re-educate. And of course, I had to go to the teacher and have a little discussion with the teacher about this and that and so on, right? So again, imagine, in the school that he went to, there was only 2 or 3 other Native kids in his classroom out of 26 or 30 Native kids. So imagine what that's like, being a little brown kid in the classroom and that's popping up on the video. And other kids, of course, know that, you're Native. I mean, imagine sort of what that experience is like, right? I remember another quick, example. When my other son, my youngest son, Sage, was in 6th grade, and part of the Minnesota curriculum here in 6th graders in social studies, they used this book called Northern Lights. And I know that there's a few folks in Minnesota here who might recognize that, right? But it's this, it's a social studies book that they use, and it's okay overall. It's okay, but there's still some problems even with that. And one of the problems that really stood out to me is that there was when they were talking in particular about, in the early 1800s and things like that, there when, folks were coming to Minnesota and so on, there was one of these assignments that this is a homework assignment. And it was like, for you to write a letter encouraging folks from Europe to come to Minnesota, to settle here in Minnesota, right? Because they wanted, more immigrants to come here and settle this land before it became a state and all of this and that business or whatever, right? And so my son, my 6th grader, my youngest son is more of kind of an activist and kind of a rebel. He's like, he's got that AIM blood in him or something, he's like, my 12th grader like wants to fit in and, just kind of, doesn't want to cause trouble or whatever. But anyway, so he's like, what kind of bullshit is this? And I'm like, exactly. What kind of bullshit is this? I'm thinking, why, I mean, imagine having a little Indian kid write a letter to tell more white folks from Europe to come and take your ancestors' land, right? So me and him were like going off on it, like, what kind of bullshit is this? This, why would I do this? And so, what? I'm going to write a letter telling them not to come to Minnesota. that, you know, my ancestors, you know, live here, right? And, you know, we don't need more white people coming here to Minnesota, right? So I'm like, oh yeah, you know, let's do that or whatever, right? So anyway, you know, but imagine, right? I mean, I don't, you know, I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. Just think about what that would do and what that could do to a lot of our Native kids of having to experience something like that, right? And again, just you know, because we're very, you know, active in our family and we talk about these things all the time or whatever, right? And, you know, I have a PhD, my wife has multiple degrees, you know, I mean, you know, we don't have a trouble raising our voices, but, you know, many Native families are not that way, right? You don't cause trouble because it's only going to come back to hurt you, right? But, you know, we were lucky in the sense that my son was also, you know, sort of very, you know, activist like that, and, you know, doesn't have a trouble speaking up and things like that or whatever, right? But imagine again, a family who doesn't have that same ability to do that and what that child is experiencing in that setting, in that classroom, right? And how hidden that is and so on, and how much of a struggle that would be, right? So what we need, you know, I know we're getting short on time, so I want to make sure I leave some time for questions here or whatever. And, you know, but one of the things that I want to, you know, quickly sort of leave folks with before we kind of open it up for questions is how do we deal with that? How do we go about trying to address some of those issues? And certainly, you know, one of the ways is we need to be able to create identity safe classrooms, identity safe campuses, buildings for our students, for our Native students in particular, where they feel safe, right? Where they, you know, are able to be who they are, where they see themselves represented in the classroom, right? Where they see themselves represented in the curriculum. And there's many, many easy ways that you can do this. And again, I'm going to go through a bunch more of this next week in particular and give you lots and lots of different examples, right? But in terms of, you know, one of the things that I think it's really, really important that we also need to sort of think about, right, is that, okay, because we're dealing with trauma, right? I mean, you know, we can't underestimate that as well, right? Is that, you know, although our students are doing the best that they can, our children are doing the best that they can, but over time, this takes its toll, right? It's not that our kids are just dropping out of school and that they can't graduate. They're being pushed out of school. They're being pushed out because they don't feel safe. And it takes its toll in terms of psychology and in terms of mental health, right? Here's what I mean by this, right? In the sense that, you know, one of my favorite quotes actually comes from my dad. He used to tell me this all the time when I was a kid. And back when I was a kid, I was like, what are you talking about, right? But he used to always say that, you know, Indian life is tough, right? It's hard to be Indian. But then he would always turn around and say, well, I'm glad I was born an Indian. And again, when I was a kid, I didn't really sort of understand what is he talking about? What's, you know, what does that mean? And so on and so forth, right? But now that, of course, that I'm older, right, I understand that, you know, what he's talking about, right, is that, you know, yes, you're going to have some struggles, you know, that there's these ideas of, you know, oppression that you're going to deal with, you know, as a Native person growing up in society. You know, our ancestors, you know, experienced lots of trauma and so on, but at the same time, there's lots of strength and pride in his life, right? And there's lots of resilience, right? I mean, just the fact that we as Native people are still here speaks to our strength. It speaks to our resilience, right? It speaks to how much we continue to survive and honor our ancestors, right? As we go through and you know, to try to do the best for our children as we go forward, right? So I mean, there was a little bit more I wanted to go over in terms of, you know, some mental health issues and working on that or whatever, but I'll try to make sure I touch base on that again next week. But I see we only have about 10 minutes left here, so I want to make sure that we, you know, open it up and have a little bit of a time for some questions or some comments or some discussion as well too before we run out of time. So Shimigwich, everybody, which is thank you in Ojibwe, by the way. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see folks here. Everybody.
Some of the questions that I wrote down in the chat. Can everybody hear me okay? If you can hear me, Brian, give a thumbs up. Okay, thank you. Some of the questions have been more along the housekeeping area, so I'll address those at the very end. But
Okay.
I'd like to leave these last few minutes to Dr. Gonzalez to answer anything specific. A lot of great commentary, a lot of great reflection from our participants. We really appreciate you being here and taking the time and wanting to learn more about how we can help our students be successful, despite everything that we come with, despite issues that our ancestors had, and see things in a more positive perspective. And as Dr. Gonzalez said, you know, we are a resilient people. So how do we want to move forward? How do we want to continue to help our children be successful so we don't see that 50% in the state of Minnesota any longer?
No, it's terrible, right? Terrible. I mean, geez, it's just like, oh man, it breaks my heart every time I look, and every year the data comes out and it doesn't change. It's like, what, you know, how can we do better? You know? So, you know, one of, you know, is there a question, or does anybody have a specific question?
You can unmute yourself if you do have a question. Go ahead, Dr. Gonzalez.
Yeah, so I was gonna say, you know, one of the things that I, you know, didn't, you know, because again, I know I have so much, and I, you know, I go off in these little tangents, these little stories every now and then or whatever. But, you know, one of the things that I think that we need to think about, both as educators, whether you're in administration, whether you're a teacher, whether you're, you know, a support staff, you know, whether you're a school counselor or, you know, a guidance counselor or a school psychologist or whatever, is that, you know, we really need to think about this concept of liberation, right? And you know, a good friend and mentor of mine, Eduardo Duran, some folks probably, you know, might know or heard of Eduardo Duran. You know, I wrote a paper with him, but, you know, he talks about this, and he really, you know, sort of helped me sort of see this as well too, is that, that, you know, this idea of liberation, some people think, you know, have sort of these misconceptions about liberation in terms of how that functions, whatever. When I'm talking about liberation, I'm not talking about freeing Native people. I'm talking about white people freeing themselves. That's really what we need to think about in terms of liberation, because even white folks, you know, are trapped in this psychology of liberation, right? Or in the psychology of oppression, right? They're their own victims of oppression, because they come to believe in this fallacy that there's something wrong with Native kids. There's something wrong with Native families. There's something wrong with Native communities. And they miss the bigger picture, in a sense that it's the system that you've all created that create the conditions that Native people experience. So this idea of liberation is really, really important for them to be able to, you know, free themselves and free their own minds from this misconception that there's something wrong with the other, right? That's what really sort of needs to happen, right? And there's this intricate dance that happens between the oppressor and the oppressed, when in fact it's the oppressed who are the ones who end up actually freeing themselves, and then freeing, you know, the oppressor at the same time, which again is this kind of, you know, interesting thing in terms of how that plays itself out, right? But, you know, Eduardo, you know, would talk about that a lot, and, you know, we'd go back and forth, sort of, you know, discussing that and thinking about it. And it really sort of just blew my mind when he first started sharing this with me or whatever. But I think it really applies to the education system in particular, right? In the sense that we need to break down these ideas of, you know, who's a teacher, who's not a teacher, who has knowledge, who doesn't have knowledge, which knowledge is supposed to be shared, or which knowledge gets privileged and which knowledge doesn't get privileged, and so on, right? So, oh yes, I see a hand up here. Awesome. It looks like Alex has a question or a comment.
Yeah,
Alex?
thank you. Yeah, this is Alex. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. And my question is that regarding education, I've been talking about in a talks with the local school district in my area regarding their mascot. They toned it down already. I guess they're changing the whole headdress. Well, it's still kind of like a headdress logo. So I have long hair, and I wear, you know, every once in a while I wear my feathers in town wherever I go. just to kind of, you know, it brings education to people because I get a lot of people asking about me. But when I go to the school, because their mascot is, you know, looks like me in a way, you know, with feathers, two feathers hanging down, you know, whatnot. So when I went over there, I actually applied for a job at the school district too, but didn't get it. But they do have a large Native American population or presence in the school. So they work with the local tribes in the area. But my question was to them and their superintendent and to their principal is, you know, how can we, well, first I asked him, what, you know, what's the curriculum and how much, you know, what's the percentage of, you know, American Indian history that you guys teach in this, you know, your school, your district area, you know, that goes, I was talking with the high school principal at the time, but they have the middle school and in their school district. Okay. So he, you know, he was unaware or he didn't know anything about, you know, what actual, just because they represent the chieftains, that's their name, their school. So, you know, what type of education, you know, it has to be, you know, give and take, you know, if you're gonna, you know, represent the culture inaccurately because it's a typical Plains headdress and stuff, you know, for a California area where it's, you know, you're kind of confused in the school, public schools, you know, the Hoover walks into that school is obviously going to get the misrepresentative, you know, so of, you know, the accurate or any type of history or, you know, accuracy or the history of this area regarding Native Americans, indigenous people. But, you know, unfortunately, the principal didn't even know or is not prone or obligated to really educate himself to actually know about that. But now their new principal now, so I have to do this whole thing over again and talk with the same school. And there's actually a new superintendent again too. So now I'm kind of back to square one. But I'm just trying to use my venue because I'm an artist, my platform or what, you know, for, you know, just to kind of, because you have to start to, you know, with the, you know, the general public in order to help educate our own people, you know. So that's where I'm targeting these schools because when I was growing up, I was, you know, I thought I came over on the ships also. So this is something that, you know, has been irking me ever since, you know, I have kids now. So, you know, this is something that my kids have long hair and they've been all, you know, I went to that same situation where he's a boy, but so, you know, what can I do? What's, you know, what circumstances, you know, what, you know, or have you seen any other school districts or whatnot, you know?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I mean, I know we're short on time, but what I'm going to ask you to do is get my contact information from folks and send me an email and I will respond to it. I have a bunch of resources on that very topic. In fact, I did my dissertation on that at the University of North Dakota. That's where I got my PhD. I did my dissertation on the Fighting Sioux over there, right? In terms of all of the issues that go along with that and school mascots. You know, the last time I checked, there was actually still like 2,100 public schools, K through 12 schools across the country that still have native mascots in their school systems, right? And you know, there's a whole line of research that shows the detrimental effects on that. You know, Stephanie Freiberg has done a lot of research in that there. There's a few others as well too that have done a bunch in that. So, you know, shoot me an email. I'll be glad to respond and give you some resources that you can use, or my email's right in there. It's in the chat right now. So just john.gonzalez@bemidji-state.edu. I really appreciate the question and I wish we had more time to go over that, but I know it's still a big issue, man. I could talk, that's a whole nother presentation. Oh my gosh. So yeah.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez, and everybody who's been participating today. On the screen before you, you have some contact people for our center. Dr. Skinstead as our director, and we have our two co-directors, Teresa Brewington and Sean Baer. Again, I'm the program manager, Dr. Allison Bays. There is a QR code there if you're savvy enough to use it. That'll take you to the link for our survey so that you can share with us your thoughts about today's presentation. And again, we always rely on your participation and your input so that we can continue to secure funding for topics like these, sessions like these. There is a second part to this. In the chat, some of you were asking, do you have to be, in order to be eligible to attend next week, did you have to attend today? The answer is no. I put the registration in the link. If you go to our main website, it is on there. Look for March 17th to register. Share it with your colleagues if they're interested. Everything is being recorded today. After today's event, all the folks who registered will get an email with the slide deck as well as the recording and a reminder about filling out the survey. So thank you for that. It's really important that you help us continue the conversation. Join us again next Thursday, March 17th, with Dr. Gonzalez as he continues the conversation with part 2, An American Indian in the Classroom. Nalit Sam, thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.